And now, The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by Absa CIB, honoured by the 2025 Salter Awards. Good evening, welcome to the programme. I'm Stephen Grootes. Well, it's kind of almost difficult to know where to start, really, with what happened today on global markets. The JSE doing all right. Asia having a tough day. I mean, the Hang Seng having its biggest fall since 1997. You probably place yourself in your life stage by where you were then. But the bizarre, absurd sort of mixed messages coming out of the Trump White House at the moment. Kevin Hassett, an economic advisor to the US President Donald Trump, went on CNBC about 2 hours ago now, said that Trump was considering a 90-day pause on the tariffs that he had imposed last week by executive order. In other words, the tariffs, the 30% tariffs that were imposed on us, the 51% tariffs that were imposed on Lesotho, would not be imposed for a period of 3 months. There'll be room for negotiation. US stock markets rallied, the JSE rallied. 10 minutes later, a Twitter account controlled by the White House described that as fake news, and the opposite happened. The markets went down 10 minutes after that. Trump himself, the US president, on Truth Social, his media network owned by himself, went on and said that essentially he was now, because China had hit the US with retaliatory tariffs, was now going to impose more tariffs of 50%. In other words, because China hit the US back, the US was going to hit them again. It's a full-blooded tariff war, really. But it is just insane. I mean, imagine trying to run an economy like this, trying to make investment decisions in this kind of situation. And through it all, because of what's happening here and because of what's happening on global markets, the rand just continues to lose value. It is a very, very difficult set of circumstances. And obviously Asia, because it's sort of Asian markets stuck in the middle of this trade war, you would expect them to lose the most value. That's what happened. Also because US markets lost significant value last week. Well, we'll get more analysis of it all through the evening for you, and particularly over the next little while. Update you on the coalition talks as well. The National Working Committee of the ANC, I presume still meeting. I've no inside knowledge, but I presume that meeting's still going on. We'll also look at options for us to diversify trade with Professor David Monyae in about half an hour from now. And Dr. Nicholas Crisp, he'll tell you about his journey through the health department, but really through the health sector of this country and others from 7:30. Good to have you along. Good to hear from you as well on 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. And your voice notes tonight, please, on 072 702 1702.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes, live on 92.7 and 106 FM. Streaming on the Prime Media Plus app.
and DSTV channel 856.
Well, really an impossible set of circumstances. Incredible tariffs coming in. We seem to have mixed messages coming from the White House, which sort of started all of this. China with a robust response. Our government, I think probably correctly, doing very little for the moment and waiting to see. And then you see the impact on global markets. Asian markets tumbling this morning. The JSE not doing too badly in the end, ending the day sort of just up. But of course, US markets, they're still open, really going up and down is the only way to describe it. Deon Gouws is the Chief Investment Officer at Credo. He joins us now. Deon, good evening to you, and thanks so much for your time. You would expect when Asian markets lost so much value this morning, when US markets have lost so much value over the last few days, and it seems again today, that the JSE could take quite a hammering, and instead it ended the day up. How do you understand what happened on the JSE today?
Yes, Stephen, thanks for the opportunity to chat. I think simply the answer to your question relates to timing of the trading day. You know, the Asian markets were basically trading while America was asleep. The JSE is, I don't know how many hours behind that. And as you spoke earlier, we've had these mixed messages today, the Kevin Hassett announcement and then the denial by the White House. So there's been different sort of timing, different news flow on the day. There's so much talk happening. People are trying to respond in real time. And you just don't know. I mean, we may see a reversal in some of the Asian markets tomorrow based on some of the news flow today. There's talk of an emergency Fed rate cut, for example, that I saw earlier on X. And that may have influenced the JSE. Clearly, that happened after the Asian markets had closed. But I'm not going to try and offer too much wisdom in terms of exactly, what explains either of the markets, because there's just so much confusion going on as we speak.
I mean, presumably, if nothing changes from now, which I suppose is unlikely, South African shares might start to fall tomorrow. The bigger question, perhaps, is how exposed are we to what's happening on international markets relative to other markets? I mean, the Hang Seng, I'd understand. They're hugely exposed to what happened. They're right in the middle of the trade war. The US, too. These are two of the major parties sort of involved in it. South Africa is slightly different, and of course resources, because of gold shares and strangely because of platinum today, are also helping the JSE stay above water.
Yeah, clearly. I mean, there are differences in the market dynamics given the underlying businesses that are represented on the JSE compared to those in the Far East. That's the first point. The second point, also the level of the tariffs. The tariffs that have been slapped onto South Africa, 30%, if I remember correctly, compared to what now looks to be over 100% in China after the additional 50% that I heard you mention earlier today. So from that perspective, the Chinese markets, the Hong Kong market, needs to respond more, sharply, and it has done so, than we will see on the JSE.
Usually when we see falls like we saw in the Hang Seng, when we see the drama we're seeing in the United States, the people in charge of the global financial system try to fix it. Wherever the problem is, they try to reform it. It may take a long time, but the fact that people are trying to fix it means that there's a reason for markets to stop falling. I hate to say it and I hate to repeat this point, but I don't think that's the case this time. I wonder if markets could go much lower simply because the cause of the problem is still in charge, so to speak.
Yes, I mean, nobody has a crystal ball. Nobody can tell you whether we're close to the bottom today, whether there's another 10 or 20% in it. And I'm not going to try and sort of speculate on that either. What I will say, though, if the typical investor and the typical person with a equity portfolio listening to this program, if they own a diversified portfolio of quality shares, they still own the same shares today that, compared to the ones they owned a week ago and a month ago. And some of these global best-in-class businesses will continue innovating, will continue improving, will continue sort of building the business over time. And they're going to be around long after Trump. And if I can offer the example of what's arguably my own favorite stock in history, which is Microsoft. Microsoft, I see today, trades at $354. Just before Christmas, it was exactly $100 earlier. And I owned it then, and I loved the share then. And if you loved Microsoft in December at $454, you should love it a lot more at $354. So 2 points. One, if you've got additional cash available, buy more of those quality stocks because, as I say, they will continue doing business. And two, if you don't have the cash, sit it out, because I have conviction that a company like Microsoft in, pick a time frame, 5 years' time, will be a bigger, better, stronger company, probably making double the profits that it makes today. And the share price will eventually catch up to that.
Deon Gouws, thank you very much indeed for the perspective. Chief Investment Officer at Credo. Let's hear now from David Shapiro, veteran stockbroker and Chief Global Equity Strategist at Sasfin, someone I'm sure you know well. David, good evening. I mean, the Hang Seng seeing its biggest drop since 1997. Is this a historic day on world markets to see drops of this magnitude? David Shapiro, I don't know if you're with us. We can't hear you, but I do know that we have a connection to you at the moment. Are you with us?
There you are. That's me.
Yes, there you are. Is this a historic day?
Pressing the wrong button. It is a historic day, I think, in the sense that we haven't seen these kind of movements since the pandemic, or before that, the financial crisis of 2007, 2008. So it's very emotive. I like what Deon says. If you're holding a good diversified portfolio, you stay with it. But the emotions around what's happening now are very hard to digest. And, particularly for investors who are not as familiar with the market as Deon and myself, it's very hard to navigate your way through these kind of periods. The difference with those previous crises was that, there was a genuine crisis. In this case, this is a self-made, self-inflicted crisis, and that's the problem. And Trump is the kind of person who's not going to blink, even if he knows he's made a mistake. And there are many, many people who are telling him that what he's doing is a disaster. And I can go on from A and end to Z. The number of fund managers, the number of economists, whether it's the Wall Street Journal, Bloomberg's, so on, so many publications, so many, well-informed people are calling this, including Bill Ackman, Ken Griffin, hedge fund managers. But he's not the kind of person to take advice from anybody. In his mind, he knows everything, and he will continue along that kind of path. So we have to wait for him to finally recognize that things are going wrong, or for somebody else around in his inner circle to say, okay, this is enough. When markets come crashing like they are at the moment, it has enormous impact on people's savings, and maybe you should just take a step backwards.
There's so many things to it. I mean, this bizarre interview where Kevin Hassett said that there might be a 90-day pause, then it's denied, then Trump doubles down in a tweet. And I mean, that hits the credibility of the people running the biggest economy on the planet. And that surely affects just the way that markets see things. I mean, all of this is shaking the kind of foundations that markets have been based on for quite some time. And if you're going to have a big change in global trading patterns, that takes time. So any recovery could be a long way away, is my concern.
It could be, because this could last for some time. It's not going to go away overnight. But I have to say something, when you said it reflects on the people in the administration, one of these, a message that's going around, and you, Stephen, as a journalist of some note, and you've been around for some time, would remember Dan Rather, who was the iconic anchor at CBS in Evening News. And he put out this message, which has gone viral. And he says he's quoted a Turkish proverb that reads, when a clown moves into a palace, he doesn't become king. The palace instead becomes a circus. So I think it's a kind of view that, people are beginning to hold on now about the administration there. And, deep concerns that the economy can't get on with what it's doing, that if you want to make any progress, you've got to make your way down to Washington and go and see the king or the clown prince, whatever you want to call him, and to negotiate with him. And you can't run economies like that. You can't run certainly an economy the size of America, where you're constantly having to go and beg or court the king. So we're in a very difficult situation, and just hope that somewhere along the line, some grown-ups come into, get into Washington and sort this whole thing out.
David Shapiro, thank you so much. Veteran stockbroker, chief global equity strategist at Sasfin.
7:02. Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Well, here at home, the ANC's National Working Committee is still in a meeting, I understand, tonight, deciding whether to stay in a coalition with the DA or kick them out of the government after the DA voted against the ANC-supported budget last week. An interesting comment by the Deputy President, Paul Mashatile, today, saying he would be ashamed to be a DA minister who voted against the budget and yet stayed in office as a minister and not resigned from the government. Sidi Madia is the EWN Associate Political Editor. Sidi, good evening to you. Is that NWC meeting still underway? Any indication of which way it's going to go?
Good evening, Stephen. No indication at all. They're still locked up in a meeting. It's kind of a long wait. You know this game very well. So I'm going to be here well into the night, starting to make calls and finding out how did it go. I think the ANC, in a bid to try and manage the leaks, is likely to have a briefing tomorrow just to bring people up to speed as to what they're thinking. In terms of how it's going to go, there's so many schools of thought about what's ideal, right? You speaking now about Paul Mashatile earlier, and I said to you when I saw you earlier that he's not an ambiguous person. The one thing you've got to give Paul Mashatile is that at these moments where people look for answers, he will speak, and will speak with clarity in terms of what is the decision and the position that the ANC has. What he uttered today, by and large, was in line with the leak that we heard from Parliament when he and the President Cyril Ramaphosa addressed the ANC caucus, right? So you've got that. But you also have people who desperately want to see the DA remaining as part of the GNU. But you have people who are angry. There's a lot of emotions. That's part of the challenge at the moment is tempers are really high still over what's happened over the weekend. And I think they're unable to find one another between the egos and the arrogance in terms of what is the bigger picture and what is the way forward. So it's very hard to tell what will be the way forward. The ANC needs to be mature in that room. And then does the DA when they eventually speak again.
Tidi Madia, really appreciate the time. EWN Associate Political Editor, thank you. Listening to that, Dr. Ungama Mtimka is the Acting Director of the Raymond Mhlaba Centre for Governance and Leadership in the Eastern Cape. Ungama, good evening to you. Do you think the ANC is going to do it? Will they remove the DA? Clearly, Paul Mashatile would like them to.
If they are contemplating it, it wouldn't be the ideal thing to do, Stephen. The ANC needs to continue to be perceived to be a party that is prudent in terms of its choice of political allies. That's not just important for ensuring that there's domestic and foreign confidence. It's a matter of survival for the ANC, especially given the changing relationships also with Washington. It's important that there aren't any drastic changes domestically that give ammunition to, countries like the U.S., but also broader than that, there's perceptions of stability in our economy, that can upset the political economic order of the day. So in my view, I think it's being immature and failing to recognize its own mistake in having some of its leaders pushing for punishment of the DA. You don't punish your partner. You can try and be a lot more persuasive in terms of, having them on board in the policy direction chosen. But the idea that the ANC could punish the Democratic Alliance, no matter how upsetting what they did was, even judged, objectively, it's just a sticking of the head in the sand and failing to move on with the political economic realities of today.
There's so many things to it. I mean, we all watched the parliamentary vote on the fiscal framework as we went to air last week on Wednesday. It was just passed. No one could predict the outcome. For the ANC to try and govern without the DA and crucially without the EFF and MK would mean exactly that kind of scenario on virtually every vote. I mean, that would be impossible, and I think we kind of all know what the market reaction would be to a tie-up with the EFF and MK.
Yeah, and there are practicalities there, Stephen. It's not just fears that, there would be an impression of going left as far, or radically left as far as the ANC is concerned. Every coalition, every partnership has an implication in terms of the internal politics of the ANC. So if, for example, the inner circle of President Cyril Ramaphosa acceded to chucking out the DA and going into a partnership with the EFF or MK party, what they would be doing as a faction would be political suicide, in the sense that that would bolster the formation of alliances that seek to position themselves for the ANC conference come 2027. So the alliance with the DA, in my view, gives government-level stability without altering significantly the internal political dynamics of the ANC. And you need both of those in order to continue to maintain stability in the country.
Dr. Ungama Mtimka, thanks very much indeed. Acting Director at the Raymond Mhlaba Centre for Governance and Leadership.
The Money Show.
The markets.
Meryl Peck is Portfolio Manager at the Old Mutual Investment Group. Meryl, good evening. I mean, what an unbelievably seesaw day. Strangely, the JSE didn't do too badly, although I'm not entirely looking forward to watching it tomorrow.
Good evening, Stephen, and good evening to your listeners. I don't know. Maybe I'm an adrenaline junkie, but I live for today's like today because I just feel like there are certain companies that you've been just waiting for a better price to buy, and it sells indiscriminately, and you can get wonderful companies at bargain prices at times like these. I think it's interesting if we take a longer term perspective. I had a look at the last 12 months and the last 3 months in dollar terms. The S&P 500 is actually 1% down over a year, whereas the Caps which is the way we like to look at the JSE, is up 10% in dollars, believe it or not. And over 3 months, the S&P is down 14%, whereas the Capital Index is down 5%. So this is actually, today, what we've seen is part of at least a 12-month trend of the JSE outperforming US markets. And I think a lot of it has to do, it's not unique, it's to do with a 20-year trend now of emerging markets underperforming the US, and the US marching along, quite bulletproof, reserve currency of the world, issuing debt, bailing out the economy time and time again. But in the background, debt to GDP has been growing, which is fine when interest rates are close to zero. But when interest rates have normalized and you are now spending more on interest payments than defense spending, becomes an unsustainable situation. And it seems like the Trump administration has decided that it is going to be their legacy to implement austerity and balance that budget. It reminds me of Germany 10 years ago. They seem very committed at this point in time to really an austerity path, irrespective of what it does to the stock market in the short term.
I mean, I presume the hunt now, if you're on the JSE, is for shares that are sort of insulated from tariffs. Yes, I mean, the great companies you talk of, but you would look for something. I mean, I know, for example, you'd probably buy a supermarket share right now.
Potentially. So you can certainly get ShopRite today, for example. Great returns, great strategy, gaining market share, strong balance sheet, at a much lower price earnings multiple. I think it's 20 times today, whereas a week ago it was at 25. You can get First Rand Bank below 2 times book, which you couldn't do for quite some time. And then there are businesses. We forget that the South African economy is not the South African stock market. Being an emerging market, we actually have quite a privilege to have access to very strong global businesses via the JSE. You take a company like Bidcorp, it's decentralized, it's focused on local supply chains in each of its regions, it has a strong balance sheet, it can consolidate, the industries that it's in. The supply chain is all about fresh produce and, servicing everything from restaurants to prisons to hotels to hospitals. And it's trading on a 1-year forward price earnings multiple of 15 PE. It's got very little exposure to the US consumer. So there are opportunities like that without even having to have an offshore account.
Meryl Peck, thank you very much indeed. Portfolio Manager at the Old Mutual Investment Group.
The Money Show
with Stephen Grootes.
Well, good to hear from you this evening. You may well have a view about Trump's tariffs, about the response to it, our response to it, on 011 883 0702 021 446 0567. Of course, also the situation around the coalition, the national coalition, that ANC meeting, I presume, still underway tonight. Voice notes, please, on 072 702 1702. Well, with all of the, I don't know what the right word is, chaos around the global trade routes, around what is surely now a global trade war involving the US and China and many other countries, it's becoming more and more obvious that we as South Africa need to trade with more countries. Generally speaking, more trade means more money for more people. Professor David Monyae is a professor of international relations and foreign policy expert at the University of Johannesburg. David, good evening. Good to talk again. I mean, more and more voices in our government, more and more voices in business, more and more people are making this point. We need to diversify our trading partners away from the US. Do you believe there's scope for that? I mean, I presume there are plenty of countries looking for more people to trade with.
No, indeed. I think we are at a time that we really need to bring the very best brains we have around, both in business and government, and ensure that we diversify our trade, take advantage of the BRICS and other global South countries. But more importantly, on our continent, I think there's more room with 1.3, 1.4 billion people on the African continent. And some of the economies, I think they can absorb some of the goods we have. While discussing with the United States, it appears that this is not a drill, it's a real, and I do not think there will be any understanding or reversal of the current situation at the moment.
I mean, it certainly looks like that. I suppose the question is, where do we start? And I mean, the point's been made by other people speaking on this program that BRICS is not really a trading bloc, well, at least not yet. And for example, to try and sell agricultural products to India, which is a very high agricultural tariffs. I mean, farmers in India are a huge lobby. I mean, I think what I'm trying to say is I think we all agree with the sentiment, but it won't happen overnight.
Oh, indeed. Also, I think it's just a question of expanding to countries that we normally don't trade with in big volumes. Countries such as your Philippines, your Kazakhstan, Latin America, and more importantly, on our continent, take advantage of BRICS in terms of China itself. There's more room. It's a question of improving a number of things in terms of the quality of our products, that what attracts understanding markets, and ensure that we do more work even within EU itself. There's so much room to expand to other products and ensure that we are not found wanting in terms of relying or over-investing all our eggs in one basket. The United States is important, but I think with time we need to lessen this dependent on this hegemonic power that appears to be abusing its power.
I mean, the two big actors really would be China, or the two big trading partners would be China and the European Union. And I presume we don't ever want to be at the mercy of one of them. We need to make sure that we're doing lots of trade with both.
Oh, yes, and we have also Brazil. It's a huge market. We have to, everything has to be done in a balanced way, and understanding the lessons that we have learned from the current crisis with the United States. And therefore, I think we need to ensure that we spread this trade, more and more volumes going Japan and other places, change the tack and ensure that we improve the products itself. We can't continue, as we always say, sell raw material and expect for us to do well. I don't think we can do well if we don't have finished products.
So, I mean, before I started this, you might remember I covered the ANC for a long time. And for as long as I can remember, going back to at least 2007, the ANC's been talking about beneficiation, and it still hasn't happened. And I kind of almost feel it never will. And I mean, I hate to say that. But I mean, surely this, if ever there was a moment, this would be it.
Yeah, I think I share your sentiments. I think the ANC government has dropped the ball on this particular issue. We shouldn't be in this situation. A number of things need to have improved. We need to have surplus energy, water, basic things, our rail. We need to be moving and shipping more and more volumes in so many other places. But it's not too late. I think there's room to improve, as well as ensure that we use the best brains we have around. The days of just talk and do nothing are over. This will have a huge implication in terms of our people. It will have huge implication in industry, unemployment, and we need to be prepared for what more is coming. You never know with Donald Trump.
David, if I may, you're also an expert on domestic politics inside China. You've studied that government for a long time. Donald Trump saying tonight that he's going to impose a further 50% tariff on products from China because of the Chinese retaliatory tariff of 34%. Let me be clear, both countries had tariffs on each other before all of this started, but it does look to me like Trump is hitting China for hitting him back. How do you think Beijing responds to that? Do they do another 50% on the US?
Oh, I think they will. I think there's this miscalculation on part of United States and to a large extent the entire Western world. The failure to understand the Chinese mindset. You cannot put such deadlines in a more humiliating way. I do not think President Xi Jinping would agree to that. He will lose face if he agrees to Donald Trump. And also, a failure to understand that the last 5-10 years, China has been preparing itself for what is happening now. So, yes, China is going to suffer, no doubt about it, in terms of the outcome of this chaos. However, I think they have a number of plans in terms of expanding stimulating growth domestically, as well as expanding to the global south. And therefore, they're lessening their trade with the Western world. And I think that will go a long way to ease the pain on what is going on right now.
Professor David Monyae, thank you very much indeed. Really appreciate the view. He is a professor and an expert on international relations and foreign policy at the University of Johannesburg.
The Money Show, Stephen Grootes, is brought to you by ABSA CIB, honored by the 2025 Salter Awards.
6 minutes now to 7 the time. Well, a new call for the legal monopoly of the post office that the post office has over what I suppose you'd call the last mile of letter delivery to be removed, and for the entire sector to sort of be opened up in some way. In other words, for the private sector to be allowed to operate in the space. It comes from the organisation Free SA. Their spokesperson is Nolotando Hlopoi. Nolotando, good evening. Thanks for your time tonight. We all know about the problems of the post office, still in business rescue as we speak to each other. What kind of investments do you believe should be allowed in this space? What are you proposing?
Hi, Stephen. Thank you so much for having me. So as an organization, we're actually proposing that the post office, of course, to be privatized, and in doing so for the government actually to be the one that does the regulation. So we'd love because currently, as we can see, the post office has been suffering for a while now. Since 2014, the post office has been bailed out for approximately 8 billion. So as we know, we've been bailing out something that has not even prospered, but also has not awakened or been resurrected. It's been suffering.
Sure. Okay. So would you have just one operator? Would that be a privately owned operator? Or would you have competition? I don't know if you can have competition in a postal system, really.
Yes, I mean, we will have multiple and have some competition in there, because also, if you're talking about monopoly, because right now the post office has a monopoly, so it'd be wiser to give it to multiple companies to run, but the government to be the one that regulates and making sure that the poor, or rather those who are in the remote spaces, they are still able to actually get the services that they require from the post office.
Okay, so how would it be? You would have, say, 2 people or 3 people across the entire country? Would you do it by regions? I mean, if they're competing against each other, it means that each operator would have to have an entire national network, and you would probably, to balance it out, have to enforce a provision that you would have to be able to deliver a letter to any address or any formal address, if you like, in the country. I mean, that would include informal settlements in Diepsloot. It would include in the far reaches of the Northern Cape, for example. It's one thing to do it with one operator. It would cost a certain amount, would be quite expensive. But for 2 people to do it or 3 people to do it would be even more expensive. I'm a great fan of competition, don't get me wrong, Nolotando. I just don't know if it would work like that.
So currently, as much as we, I wouldn't say we don't have all the answers, but the main thing, as we can see right now, Stephen, we have multiple, if we could talk about delivery services, isn't it? And we get to choose which ones that we want to use. Even the exact companies, they get to choose which ones they want to use. I know for a fact that that is actually quite different when it comes to government and the services that the post office currently offers. However, when we put capable companies on the table and coming with a strategy with the government, actually, when the government invites these companies, I believe that can actually be managed quite well.
Yeah, I mean, I'm sorry to interrupt you, Nolotando. I mean, I hear you, but I mean, to courier something will cost, call it 50 to 100 rand for a document, right? I mean, if I want my my car license couriered to me, it's 100 rand. It's a tiny piece of paper. If the post office was working in the past, it would have cost me, I don't know, 2 rand. Let's call it under 10 rand. Now,
Definitely.
what I'm talking about is that the economics are completely different between a post office and a courier service, and completely different.
Definitely, I know that. Like I said, when the government steps in to regulate, making sure that the services are not as expensive as they currently are right now. Because after all, it is meant to be, of course, a service that is for the people, of course,
Sure.
but rather also not to be actually free, of course, but to be as affordable as possible. Because if we think about it, if we were to make a comparison with Eskom, I know it's quite different. We are currently paying a hefty amount when it comes to our electricity, even though, of course, it is it's owned by the government currently, but we're still paying quite a lot. So
Okay, but I hear, but it's a completely different business. What I'm trying to get to is, I'm trying to get you to convince me that what you're suggesting is feasible. And I don't think that just saying the government will regulate makes it feasible. I'm trying to understand the economics that would allow a service or three services to compete against each other, to be able to deliver a piece of paper to every single address in the country and do it at an affordable price and still make a profit. And I don't know if the economics of that work.
Well, I believe currently right now we both can actually agree. The post office needs some solution, and currently we've seen the government cannot deliver. So therefore, inviting actually the private sector to come with a strategic way that can still continue in terms of it being actually affordable. Then in that way, we'll be able to get actually the solution in terms of making sure that the post office is still alive and also people are actually still getting the services that they need. So that is what we're actually proposing.
Okay. I don't know if there's the political appetite for it. I mean, Solly Malatsi is the communications minister. He's from the DA. I don't know if you'll be the minister tomorrow.
Okay, we need to get to the part of the political part into it. But as he has actually said right now, the most focus for us, of course, is to making sure that we save this institution, which was once quite profitable, and also it was working, and it was assisting the people that they needed the most.
Thank you. Nolotando Hlopoi is the spokesperson at Free SA. You're with The Money Show, 7 o'clock.
And now, The Money Show
With Stephen Grootes on 702.
Let's walk the talk.
The Money Show with Stephen Grootes is brought to you by ABSA CIB, honoured by the 2025 Salter Awards. Good evening. Plenty coming up. We'll speak to Anne Bernstein, the Executive Director at the Centre for Development and Enterprise, in just a moment. Their latest suggestion, I should say, to try and stimulate the economy. It involves special economic zones and labour regulations. Also, I'm sure you're one of these people, and I think we've all tried to do it, to make a change, do something that is better for ourselves, for our lives, for the people around us. We'll look at a book that's all about that. And, you know, I think if you go to the sort of airport bookshop and go to the leadership section, about half of them will be around this subject. But this does seem to be a cut above the others. And then I'm fascinated by the career of Dr. Nicholas Crisp, how you carve out a career as a health consultant, work in many countries, end up running the NHI system here. But also, of course, you may recall during the vaccine period of the pandemic, he was in charge of that too. I'm looking forward to discussing his career with him on how I make my money from around 7:30 this evening.
702.
702.
Stephen is on The Money Show.
6 to 8 p.m.
Another suggestion from the Centre for Development and Enterprise out this month about how to grow our economy, suggesting, in fact, that special economic zones could be given a bigger role in our economy. And crucially, the special economic zone in Kocha could allow companies to employ people with less restrictive labour laws or labour regulations than is currently the case. In some ways, this gets to the heart of one of the big economic debates in South Africa around labour regulations and how to compete with other countries. Anne Bernstein is the Executive Director at the Centre for Development and Enterprise. Anne, good evening to you. Do appreciate the time. We know the Kocha Special Development Zone is still going. You're specifically suggesting employers there should be allowed to employ people under a sort of different labour regime. What are you suggesting?
Good evening, Stephen, and your listeners. Thank you for having me on your program. Well, Kocha is the largest and the oldest of the country's special zones. These are geographic areas where you make them different from the rest of the economy. And we have excellent infrastructure there that we've already paid for, but this zone is mostly empty, bare felt. And we're saying this is an ideal place in a region of the country with a lot of unemployment, where it's got its own port. We could experiment can we develop a low-skill manufacturing zone that attracts foreign investment and produces goods for export? So that's the idea. And we're saying that zones around the world, many of them fail. There are some spectacular successes. South Africa's current zones, I think, have to be described as failing. We put almost as much money in, our tax money, in building infrastructure as we have attracted investment. And a lot of that investment was companies or factories moving from one part of South Africa into a zone. And we're saying, if you look at China, if you look at Asia, and a number of other countries, there are successful zones, and you've got to make this place special, different from the rest of the economy, and trying out, if you change the rules that operate in the rest of the economy, can we get a very successful zone going? That's the idea of this.
I mean, as you say, it's been tried in many places and there have been some big successes. Are you referring specifically to wages and the way in which people are employed?
So one of the key things, especially when it comes to low-skill manufacturing, T-shirts, sort of basic clothing, toy assembly, very sort of low-skill activities, wages and working conditions are absolutely central to whether or not a zone can succeed. And we're not calling for sweeping national labor law reform. We're saying we want wages and working conditions negotiated at factory level so that these factories in the zone are excluded from collective bargaining agreements, which have been a big problem for all those people who are not part of that agreement, and then the deal is applied to them. So wages and working conditions need to be negotiated at factory level. This is a very fast-moving world, low-intensive manufacturing, and you get orders that have to be, 1 million purple T-shirts in 2 weeks' time. You've got to work overtime. You've got to talk about productivity. You've got to have some flexibility to compete with zones around the world. So wages very important, and working conditions. Then only firms engaged in new activities. We're saying you can't move your factory from somewhere else to here. We're looking for new investment, mainly foreign, but also domestic. And the goods produced in the zone must be for export so that you're not competing unfairly with firms outside the zone that have to deal with different rules. We want duty-free imports to this zone so that they can get the materials they need. And we need relaxed restrictions for skilled foreign managers who know how to run factories like this. And then we're saying increasingly around the world, the successful zones are being run by private companies where they make this zone as attractive as possible. They promote it to the investors they know, and they kind of manage and are entrepreneurial in how they do this. So commercial firms should run these zones, and we think that this might be able to give us a chance to really compete and create large numbers of jobs.
Okay, I mean, obviously we need the jobs. We need to do something different. I mean, I agree with all of that. You say in your documentation, I wasn't able to read it all fully, and I'd like to read it all again, but you suggest, for example, that no one would be paid less than the national minimum wage. I mean, would you allow unions to negotiate locally, or are you looking at something a little tougher than that?
Well, look, we're saying basic health and safety laws have to be applied, so that's number one. The national minimum wage would be applied, and we would use the government's, the ETR, the employment tax incentive, to help employers to meet the national minimum wage. I think, people can organize, but these are some of the bedrock rules that could give us a chance. So within these rules, yes, but we're not going to, this zone can't be a success if you move away from some basic rules that we're saying have to be established for us to be competitive. That's the whole thrust. South Africa is desperate for foreign direct investment and especially for manufacturing that is not high skill. And so that's the context within which we need to think about these zones.
So I don't disagree with any of that, and in a way I'm glad that there may now be a debate around this, because it's been one of the big sort of tensions for a long time. There is an argument against it, of course, which I must mention, that, for example, if you're going to take on Shein or Temu, or maybe you're going to do it in a different way or go for a different end of the market, but it's quite a rough world because you end up as a sort of race to the bottom. That's certainly what the unions will argue. Whoever can pay their workers the least will win. And I'm sorry, but that ends up with kind of North Korea winning. And that's a very rough world to live in. I mean, we need to do something. I completely agree. We need to do something different. I completely agree with that too. But the argument will come against you in that way.
Absolutely. There are critics of this. I think the best response, there are two responses to that. The one is that of the former president of Mexico, who was asked exactly the question you're raising. And he said the following: some people think there is a choice between low-paying jobs and high-paying jobs. The problem is in countries like Mexico and, I would add, in South Africa, that isn't the choice. The choice is a low-paying job in the beginning or no job at all. And we're a country with 12.3 million people who would like to work but cannot find a job. And if you look at the successful developing countries around the world, they have used low-skill manufacturing, and we can still do this. So that's the one issue. I think the other is we're saying, okay, we can't get wholesale labor reform of the limited kind we're asking for across South Africa. Why don't we just try it out? We're not affecting other people's rights. We're protecting this zone. Whoever wants to work there at the sort of minimum wage, let them work there. Let's see, can we make a success of this? Because the truth is, Stephen, that the economy is stagnant. The situation with unemployment is catastrophic, and we're not making indents in this. And the whole zone program the state has spent billions of rand on is not really working. And partly that's because the zones we have now are not very special. They're very similar to the rest of the economy. And we're saying, let's experiment. It's what Mauritius did. They had vested interests who said, over our dead body, we want protection and we want high wages and whatever. And they set up zones with different rules. And this was remarkably successful. The same in China. They said, we don't like capitalism, the foreign devil. Deng managed to get a few zones going in the south of China with different rules, and they worked. And then it became sort of demonstration that there was another way to go, that, people think the low wages are static. You come in and you have just a basic minimum wage and that's it forever. But that's not the case at all. China's wages are now too high, and that's why many factories have moved out of this low-skill manufacturing area to Bangladesh, to the Philippines, to Vietnam, to Laos, Cambodia. And so things move, and not just individuals' lives start to change, but the local firms around a successful zone start learning as well. They get into value chains and they get better at competing in the global marketplace. So you have to say, yes, there will be some opposition, but really, what do we have to lose as a society when things are so bad?
And Bernstein, thank you very much indeed. Director at the Centre for Development and Enterprise.
The Money Show.
Business Books.
Well, I'm sure from time to time you've heard conversations about how to make a change in your life. And I made the point earlier that probably half the books in the leadership section at any airport bookshop are about precisely that. But this one looks slightly different, a cut above the rest, if I may say. It's called Reset: How to Change What's Not Working. It's by Dan Heath. Ian Mann is the MD at Gateways Business Consultants, who's been looking at it for us. Ian, good evening. Thanks so much for coming in.
I think that you're quite right about many, many books about this. The one thing about Dan Heath is he's written many, many books. I mean, 5 or 6 that I've read. One thing about him is that he's capable of dealing with simplicity on the other side of complexity. He takes very complex issues and doesn't trivialize them, but seems to have worked his way through the complexity to get to the simplicity. And this is no different. All businesses, absolutely everyone, is faced by the fact that parts of their business don't work. Sometimes they don't work because we've been doing like this for years. When you go back into why you did it, the reason why you did it has changed. Or the people have changed, all sorts of things. And we don't keep up, and it often creates real jams in the business and are very expensive. And what he's done, he's got a very, very gentle, very easy, and deceptively simple way of doing this. I say deceptively simple because you can't believe that you actually can solve these sorts of problems using this structure. And he does, and the problems that he solved are in places like hospitals as well as factories, and he also, of course, uses schools and life events as well. So I just want to take you through there's 2 parts to his book. One is showing you what the first step you have to do is find the leverage points, because often we say all of this is a mess. No, all of it is not a mess. Something inside there's a leverage point. And he likes the idea of a leverage. So if you imagine trying to move a rock, and you've got a long lever, you don't have to put that much effort in, but you can still make movements. So the first part of the book deals with that. And then the second part is, well, you've got a lot of resources, so stack them up on the lever, and you'll be able to get things to move.
So, I mean, it's partly about if you keep pushing in a certain direction, you will eventually change the shape of the graph.
Indeed. And that starts off by being sure that you know what you're doing. Because what happens is when you're faced with a complex situation, I can tell you, I've seen this so many times, I'm sure you've seen this as well. You get the smart people together and say, so what do you think? And then we have like an idea fest. And at the end of it, the person who talks the loudest or is the strongest, we go for his idea. He says, no, completely wrong. What you have to do is you have to go there and see the work. Go and see it. And when you go and see it, he says, be sure that you ask the people actually doing the work what they think, and then keep quiet. He says you'll be astounded. The people who are doing the work are not geniuses who've got good hearts, and they are right there at the coalface, and you ask them what's going wrong, boy, will they tell you exactly what's going wrong. So the very first thing you've got to do is don't sit in the boardroom and discuss it. Get out there and actually ask the people, you tell me what you see that's not working, and then you'll be able to start working on it. The second thing you've got to do is you've got to be sure that you've got the goal of the goal. Now, the goal of the goal is quite an important one. And he has he uses examples from business and other places, research sometimes. And one of this I think is what would be his best. In 2007, the Eurostar was being speeded up so it could get from London to Paris quicker. It was taking about 2 hours and 35 minutes. They put £6 billion into it, and they got it down from 2 hours, 35 minutes to 2 hours and 20 minutes. And he said, what would you say? It's definitely faster, 20 minutes faster, and we did a good job, tick the box. He says, you probably didn't. What you have to do is ask yourself the question, could we have done it better? He says, if you'd spent 1% of that 6 billion putting Wi-Fi, remember we're talking about 2007, putting Wi-Fi in the train, they wouldn't have got there faster, but they would have enjoyed and felt that their time was better spent. He said, if you're prepared to spend 10% of your 6 billion, you could get every single supermodel, male and female, in the world to serve Chateau, wherever it is, superb wine to everybody on the train. They wouldn't mind the least bit that it was 20 minutes late. In fact, they'd probably ask you to go slower. So he says, we've got to be sure that the what we're looking for is the real answer, not the play answer. So you need to consider the goal of the goal. And he gives examples of people in their daily lives as well. When you have to look at the goal of the goal, what am I really, really trying to achieve when I try to do that? Very often it's got nothing to do with it. But I love the idea of a goal of the goal, getting to the heart of things. The third thing he says is you study your bright spots, either yours or somebody like you's bright spots. He says the beauty of studying bright spots is that somebody else has done it right. And that somebody else might have been you. You might have even done it right. So if you did it right there, shouldn't you be able to do it right here? And these are all ways in which you can get to the heart of things and be able to do them rather quickly. The fourth part of it, he says, is we've got to target the real constraint, the one thing that's really holding you up. And it requires you to think quite deeply about this. For example, if you're providing home care to the elderly, probably your biggest problem is to find quality staff who are prepared to stay at that price. Because the elderly don't have a lot of money, and so you have to find people. And so how would you deal with the problem? If that's the problem, and you're quite sure that is the problem, then you can start working on the solution, which may be hire a lot better and really see that the staff want to stay. If you can do those things, you've solved your problem because you've targeted the real constraint. The idea here is to do the analysis properly and get that part of things done. And the other aspect that he mentions, which is really very clever, he says we generally look at the activity itself. We don't look at the system. And he says that understanding the system is often where you can find a lot of opportunities. The example he gives, he says lots of children matriculants are given career guidance in matric. Then they go to college, then they look for jobs, and it doesn't work. He was the group he is referring to was particularly concerned with people with kids from poor homes. And they had a hard time in the United States finding jobs. They go for interviews and what he realized that there's a whole system. There's work on the one side, there's primary school on the other, but in between that there are lots of systems. Where's the correct place to put the emphasis? And he said he came to the realization, the group that he's referring to, came to the realization that what we've got to do is we've got to look at the whole system and say, where will it work best? And that's just before, when they're graduating, just before they actually go out into the world of work, that's when you train them how to do interviews and so on.
It seems like quite a fresh approach compared to all of the other sort of books in the leadership section.
Yes, it is. It's very fresh. It's very usable. And it applies, even if you're not a business person, understand it can apply to your life as well. He refers to a woman that a couple were having difficulty, and they looked at the constraint. The constraint was centered around appreciation. And they said, well, that's really the problem between you. You don't feel neither of you are appreciating each other, which is why there's all this friction. If you could and what he did was he started with Post-it notes. He said, the woman said to the couple, you must write each other a Post-it note, at least a couple of Post-it notes a day. I appreciate you're doing this. I noticed you did that. And just the noticing has that sort of effect because you're changing the context. So I think that the book can be used in a lot of different circumstances, and I think a lot more people should be reading this, mainly because it's simplicity on the other side of complexity.
Thank you very much indeed, Ian Mann. I really appreciate the time. He is MD at Gateways Business Consultants. The book is called Reset: How to Change What's Not Working. It's by Dan Heath. I'm sure you'll be able to Google from Dan Heath. The book is Reset: How to Change What's Not Working. Ian, thanks very much indeed. Time to have a look at the career of someone who's done something interesting with their lives. And from time to time on this radio station, you'll hear conversations about the NHI. Often in those conversations, you'll hear the voice of the person who's in charge of that process for the National Department of Health. And when you hear him, you may remember the pandemic, because for various reasons, he was also for a time the person in charge of arranging vaccines during a very difficult time in sort of South African and global history. The person I'm talking about is Dr. Nicholas Crisp. His current position is Deputy Director General of the National Department of Health, and he's agreed to spend some time talking to you tonight about his career. Nicholas, I've reported on you for many years. We've spoken for a long time. Never got a chance to do something like this, so thank you so much for taking up the invitation.
Hi, Stephen, and good evening to the listeners. Thanks very much. Not sure what to expect.
It's really about you. I think for a lot of for many of us, perhaps the first time we heard you was just before the pandemic, around the NHI. You've had a very long career in health before that, though. Where did it start? Where did you grow up?
Yeah, so Stephen, I'm a born South African from the Eastern Cape, but when I was about a year old, my parents moved to what was Salisbury, and so I grew up in what was Rhodesia and is now Zimbabwe. I was schooled there till the end of what was Form 3. So I came to do Standard 9 and Matric in South Africa.
Okay, I mean, and after that, you studied at UCT. Clearly, you did all right in matric to do medicine at UCT.
Well, it wasn't as easy as that. I finished school before I was 17, and I didn't get into medicine, so I went to the army first to contemplate my options. I went to UCT to do a BSc and did well in my first year, so I was fortunate to get straight into second year medicine. So it was a difficult start.
Okay. I mean, most of the interesting people had a difficult start, I found. You had an internship at 2 military hospitals, and this was in the 1980s, and South Africa was a completely different country then. What was that experience like in a military hospital at the time? And I mean, I presume a military hospital may be dealing with soldiers, but also dealing with their families and other people.
Yeah, in fact, it was a very boring time. The 6 months that I was there, we as interns didn't really do much at all, and because I was a civilian, it was quite difficult to fit into what was happening there. So I only spent 6 months there. Then I moved to Letaba Hospital in the Lowveld. That was a far more fulfilling experience. So I stayed there for a few more years.
So Letaba Hospital, I'd like to know a bit more about that experience because, it was, I presume, away from the big centers, again, a very different country then. You say that it was more fulfilling. I presume it was because you were actually helping people. You were treating patients. You were improving people's lives.
Yeah, well, Stephen, at that stage of my life, I still wanted to be an orthopedic surgeon, and there had been a polio epidemic in 1982. So when my wife and I arrived there in 1984, there were a lot of young people, mostly young people, some adolescents and young adults, who were quite badly deformed. And so I was working with surgeons from Wits University and a whole lot of students who were coming through there, and we were working with the Letaba School for the Physically Disabled and doing a lot of reconstructive surgery, calipers and so forth. Even without physiotherapists, it was quite a rudimentary space, but making a massive difference to the lives of people. But then I realized that we were going to get another epidemic because the care of the vaccines was really poor, and that's where my life with vaccines started in 1986, where a colleague, Carl Eiselmaiden, and I and a couple of others decided we better go about setting up the vaccination program in that part of the northern part of the country. And that's where I learned the power of preventive healthcare.
I mean, it must have been quite something to do. I mean, for people I'm a little younger than you, but I don't really think of polio. And yet I worked very closely for a long time with someone who, when you talk about the timing of it, must have been a victim of it at the time. That must have been quite an empowering experience. I mean, quite scary in a way because of the cause of it. I'm quite intrigued by the fact that you say that one of the reasons was that vaccines hadn't been properly cared for.
Yeah, well, it's a long story. So while I was there, I also saw a lot of neonatal tetanus. In 1 year, I recorded 53 babies with neonatal tetanus. And because we were looking after the refugees at a camp called Lulakani, who were coming through from the Mozambique War, I was also working as a medical officer there from time to time. And there was a big marquee tent where literally over 1,000 people got measles in 1 day. Or I saw them all in 1 day. Massive epidemic in the tents. There were elderly people in their 70s. There were people blinded, children with permanent lung damage, and so on. So it was quite dramatic to see that without vaccines, what we were taking for granted in other parts of the country was devastating people's lives. So the challenge was to then set up a proper cold chain, get the vaccines properly procured, properly distributed. At one stage, the nurses called me Dr. Fridge because I was so adamant about the way that fridges were to be managed and vaccines were to be stored. I went around putting locks on all the fridges, and everyone wanted to know, do they cost that much? And I said, yes, they cost lives. So that was my introduction to vaccination and primary health care back in the 1986, 87, 88.
Was it just vaccinations against polio or vaccinations against measles and other diseases as well?
No, it was all of the vaccinations. Polio, we were using oral vaccine, and so what was happening is they were freezing and thawing the vaccine repeatedly, so it became impotent, and also storing large amounts of vaccine in peripheral clinics. And in those days, there was no power, there was no solar, so it was gas fridges. and from time to time the gas would run out and not be replenished on time. And then the vaccines would thaw, and they were still using them. So we set about putting a proper vaccination system in place.
Sure. Was there much support from government at the time? A very different government, of course.
So I was I was seconded from the Transvaal administration. Most of us, the white guys, were all seconded to the homelands, and I worked in a homeland called Gazankulu. There were many parts and pieces of that homeland, and then there were many more of Leboa and Venda, and we also had in that part of the world Kangwani and Kwandebele. So only about 3% of the population lived in what we called white areas, and everybody else lived in these homeland areas. So it was quite challenging because, trying to treat a TB patient who worked in the white area farms, was a Sotho-speaking resident of Leboa, but was coming to a Gazankulu hospital, and nobody wanted to pay for their care because they weren't getting the budget for this part of the population. So it was a constant problem, and we as doctors were always looking for ways to work with one another. We were very few in those days, so we mostly knew one another in the hospitals around the area, and we would do what we can to make sure that everybody got their treatment.
It's quite astonishing to hear you talk about it, because it sounds like something out of a bizarre movie, and yet, I know it happened, and I know it was awful and absurd, and yet it's quite something that it's such recent history and still has such a big impact. I was going to ask what medicine was like in those days for two reasons. One was because of apartheid and partly what you've just described, and the other was because it was kind of pre-HIV. And I had in my head, incorrectly I suppose, that perhaps the disease load was lower. But to hear you describe polio and measles outbreaks like that, clearly that's not true.
Oh, we had thousands of patients with typhoid. Every second person had bilharzia because there was no running water and, not piped and tapped water to the villages around us. These days, you think of enteric fever as something that's very, very rare, but every second patient we used to see who was delirious had typhoid. We did have a cholera epidemic at one stage as well. And then, of course, malaria was widespread because the control program could only go up as far as the border. There wasn't very good collaboration with the neighbors in what became Zimbabwe and Mozambique. So, looking after all those patients, it was there were a lot of TB and, malnutrition was abundant. We used to see marasmus, marasmic kwashiorkor and kwashiorkor frequently. Children with severe diarrhea and underweight. So it was just a different spectrum of disease, but there were plenty sick people and lots for us to do.
It must have, all of this, you must have, Nicholas, had maybe a sense of mission about being a doctor? To see this all happening around you and to be trying to do something under-resourced, I presume. Was there a bit of a sense of mission? I know that gets a lot of people in the medical field through very difficult times.
Yeah, well, those of us who worked up there at that time, as I say, we were very few, but we used to joke with one another that there are only three reasons that you continue to work there, and they all begin with M. You're either mad, you're mercenary, or you're missionary. So the mad ones are self-explanatory. The mercenaries were the people who went there to learn to do procedures. We were, as a medical officer, in fact, as an intern on my first day, I was told I've either got a cut or dope for a cesarean section. These days, you wouldn't even dream of the medical officers doing that. So, you went there to get experience, or you were missionary for one or other reason, and some of us were all three, I suppose. We believed we were doing good. We wanted to do good, and that's why we'd studied medicine in the first place.
You were, after that, you did various things, and you did work as a consultant, I understand, in Nigeria, setting up an agency there. This is a lot later, of course. What was that experience like to work? And you haven't just worked in Nigeria, you've worked in many other countries on our continent. What have those experiences been like?
Yeah, so what had happened is that I was the regional director for the Northern Transvaal, even though I couldn't speak Afrikaans at the time. And after the elections, I was asked to stay on and head up the establishment of the new Limpopo Health Service, which I did until 1999. So I had worked very closely with donor agencies for the first time, and I was asked by the British government, it's called DFID at the time, the Department for International Development, if I would go to Nigeria and be part of a small team to work 6 months after the end of the military government and start reconstructing the health services in Nigeria. It was frightening the first time. There were no electricity, no telephones. I was gone for a month. Excuse me. And it was a very interesting exercise being in a very, very different place.
I mean, I presume you, and take a moment to cough if you need to, but I presume it also sort of suggested, some of the problems would have been roughly the same. That's probably why they asked you. And some of them might also have been quite different, but the main problems often come down to the same thing, which is sort of organization and resources.
Yeah, look, Nigeria is a very, very different place from South Africa. For a start, there are a lot more people there. It's a lot more rudimentary in what was accessible at the time. We're talking about 2000. And there was a lot of politics. Everybody was still carrying a gun. I'm talking about, every second person walking around in a uniform with a rifle, not necessarily demobilized. And they had basically destroyed their primary healthcare system. They were trying to build just a polio program, but not really an integrated primary healthcare system. And there were a number of Nigerians who'd left the country and came back as, from the diaspora, and were trying to set up a reform process. We set up an organization called HERFON, the Health Reform Foundation of Nigeria. So I was a founder of that. And then working with the ministry, I worked with 7 ministers of health in Nigeria, actually, over a 16-year period, and systematically got some things in place, including an agency to begin to look after HIV and AIDS.
Quite something. We're speaking to Dr. Nicholas Crisp. He's telling you about his career this evening. He's currently the Deputy Director General in the National Department of Health. Continuing your conversation this evening with Dr. Nicholas Crisp, talking about his life and his career. He's currently Deputy Director General in the National Department of Health. Nicholas, I'd like to talk a little bit about the COVID-19 pandemic, if I may, because I remember speaking to you just before that, and you were implementing the NHI, and we'll talk about that in a moment. But suddenly, obviously, during COVID, your department was in the limelight, and for various reasons, the Director General was not able to fulfill their duties. The Health Minister at the time was under fire for things that had nothing to do with you. And the big question was around vaccines and when are we going to get them? That must have been quite tough. I mean, you had everybody clamoring for one, quite understandably. You had vaccine skepticism too. And the big problem was a shortage of doses.
Yeah, that was a very difficult time for me. First of all, I wasn't a public servant at the time, so I had been working as a consultant for Dr. Mkhize when he was the minister, helping to think through what to do next to get the NHI going. And then COVID happened, and so I got stuck in Pretoria and couldn't go home. So I wasn't going to just sit around. I started helping out, and one of the non-government organizations realized I wasn't being paid, so started paying me something. And I just found things to do. And then the popo hit the fan, as you will recall, and we lost the minister. The Director General wasn't around. I just applied for the position of Deputy Director General for NHI because I thought, well, I've got a few more years left in me. And I found myself having to be acting Director General. I didn't know anybody. We were busy moving the offices from Civitas building to a new building. I hadn't been part of the initial procurement process on the vaccines, and I had to learn very, very fast. But fortunately, having been previously in the system, there were people that I knew, and they kindly brought me up to speed quite fast, and I was able to make my contribution.
I mean, for a little while, you were sort of the public face of that, and that can't have been easy because everybody wanted a vaccine, and then there were people who didn't want one, and you had to convince them too.
Yeah, it was quite a difficult time trying to, first of all, to stay awake because we had very, very long hours and lots of meetings going on behind the scenes, briefing the president and the cabinet and the interministerial committee, We'd had a change of ministers. We had an acting minister for a short while who needed to be brought up to speed every time. I was trying to find out from the labs. Fortunately, I understand the lab environment reasonably well. So the colleagues who were there, you'll remember them, were fantastic in briefing me and keeping me informed of what was going on. But there was nobody else who was available to step up and do the communication. So I just filled the space while I was there.
Well, I think the nation owes you a debt, frankly, for that. I look back at it a bit now, and as a journalist, and I had no first-hand knowledge of what was going on in the procurement process. But I think I speak for many people, perhaps, when I suggest that I think the president has sort of made this point, perhaps not directly. I wonder if we got ripped off a bit by the vaccine manufacturers. And I realize I can say that as a journalist, you still hold a position in the department. So let me come at it slightly obliquely. Do you have some frustration about what happened then?
Look, so I think that's all very well in the public domain now, and there's been a court case, and we were forced to make public some documents where which had been we'd been sworn to confidentiality and so on. So I think everyone knows, not just South Africa, the whole of the third world got vaccines last. We did pay more than we should have paid for them. We were very unhappy that we were not able to cancel certain contracts where the vaccine hadn't even been manufactured yet when it became clear we were never going to use them. We turned up, our private sector turned out and assisted with the packaging of vaccines for the whole of Europe, and then we were told we couldn't have them. They must first go to Europe, and then we'll take what's left and so on. There were many things that made us extremely unhappy. When we announced Omicron and they shut our borders, and then asked us for samples of the vaccine. My response immediately was, no, there's no airlines. And they said they'll send a jet to fetch. And I said, no, you can't. We're not. Go and get them in your own backyard. By the time we've got Omicron, you've got Omicron as well. So, it was a time of, just everybody trying to find a home and a space, and lots of goodwill as well. But the procurement space was extremely difficult.
I've seen you on various platforms defending the NHI, and it sort of is your job. To hear you talk about your experience as a younger man, I can completely understand why you would propose it and defend it. And that's not sort of the conversation I want to have. The conversation I want to have is slightly different, which is that the NHI in the end is about ending health inequality. And health inequality in any society is always controversial. And in some ways, so it should be. But are you surprised by how many people oppose the NHI, I suppose is what I'm trying to ask you?
No, not at all. We expected it. That for many people, healthcare is an industry where they make a lot of money. And if you design a system that allows for a lot of offtake, and it's very complicated with lots and lots of duplication, there's opportunities for fraud, there's opportunities for profit taking at every turn. So, and the amounts we're talking about are not small. So we know, and we have worked with other countries, so we know from the other countries that this is not unique to us. So no, we're not surprised at all. It's just we have a particularly litigious society where everyone thinks that the courts must solve the problem. Many times we have asked parties to come sit around the table, but we see deliberate misinterpretations, deliberate misinformation, and not even attempting to understand what we're trying to do. A week ago, we were in the G20, and other countries are telling us we're doing a magnificent job. I felt like I had schizophrenia. In South Africa, we're told what a terrible job we're doing, and the world says we're doing a fantastic job. So, no, I don't think that we're on the wrong path at all, and we will continue to explain and defend what we're doing.
Dr. Nicholas Crisp, we do have to end it there. I reserve the right to argue with you next time, but thank you very much indeed for speaking to us, but for what you've done for the nation as well.
Thank you, Stephen. Pleasure talking to you tonight. Thanks.
Dr. Nicholas Crisp is the Deputy Director General in the National Department of Health.